I've recently come here for two very interesting lectures about the increasing beliefs in the primacy of nature over nurture in dictating people's psychological characteristics through their genes. Do you think you'll ever be able to tell what his psychological characteristics were?
Well, okay, so at the moment, because a lot of people say to me, so will you be able to tell if Richard was as awful as Shakespeare paints him to be? At the moment, no. There's the thing known as the worrier-warrior gene. There's things like this that people are starting to pick out stuff. It's a little bit, we're not there yet. But one of the things that I quite like about this particular project is I know people are working on that sort of thing. The stuff with the whole genome analysis, all of that is going to go online, so it will be available for everyone to look at. And I quite like that because it means that the life of this project goes beyond our involvement in it. It goes on to things. So if they are ever able to pull out that sort of thing, and I'm skeptical for a lot of it, I think they will be able to have a look at this in Richard, but I don't think we're ever going to be able to say if somebody's kind of going to murder their nephews or something like that.
So are you managing to get whole genome now?
Yes. Yeah.
So the DNA, the kind of DNA that you need is...
So it's very, very short fragments. So what you need to do is so when you do whole genome sequencing, what you do is you get all the DNA that's there. So a lot of the DNA, when you're looking at ancient remains, is not actually from the person. It's rubbish that's in the soil and things like that.
Course,
so
yes.
You get what's known as endogenous DNA to the individual. So it means that you get as much as you can, and then you sequence everything, and there's algorithms that go, right, that DNA sequence is actually from chromosome 1, that one's from chromosome 7, that's from whatever. If you do that enough time, you get what's known as coverage of the genome. And yes, we've got good coverage for him. So we're working through doing the analysis at the moment. It should be published in the new year.
And just one more thing. Is it surprising that you only found one difference between the mitochondrial DNA of Wendy and...
No, so you can actually look at the sort of we've actually got it down to sort of individual-ish mutation rates of various sites on the mitochondrial genome, and that's a fairly fast mutating site. So that was not surprising at all with this one, with the number of generations.
But only one?
Only one. Yeah. And that was what you would expect from that particular sort of location. Yeah, it was not surprising at all.
I'm interested in the statistics saying how unlikely it is or how likely it is if you live within the same country. Within my own family, there's a long-held rumor that we were descended from General Lafayette, and that was never of very great interest until I went to work in the UN in New York, and I wasn't very interested in it, but the Americans were very interested in it. And of course, I then had to start saying, well, there's no truth in it, and I don't believe it, because they began to get a bit cross that I was saying that I might be descended from this great Frenchman who'd helped the Americans with the revolution. So when you cross an international border like that, I mean, here you can say that people are very likely to be descended from Richard III, which makes it one thing. So how does it stretch across international borders?
That's absolutely fine. So, for example, are you doing Y chromosome or mitochondrial DNA or anything with it? So for example, with my surname study, one of the surnames that I was looking at was Jefferson. So one of the cases that had been in the lab years ago was Thomas Jefferson case. So was he the father of children with his slave Sally Hemings? And we had the Jefferson family thing. And I was looking at Jeffersons in this country, and two of them had identical Y chromosome types or near identical Y chromosome types to the Thomas Jefferson family. So that's actually one of the quite nice things you can do with genetics, is you can actually, across countries, start to join families. So when we were doing this, we were looking to see, so is this a mitochondrial DNA type that's very common in Europe? Because that would have been quite an important thing. So if it was a very common mitochondrial DNA type, we'd be kind of going, okay, so statistically that's not terribly significant. We were fortunate that it was very rare. We wanted to look within Europe because that's where we knew his family history was from. But in terms of connecting families across continents, that's perfectly fine because you're looking for genetic matches across. That's why it's family history. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Was there a particular eureka moment for you when you realised you'd found him, or was it a slow process and a gradual realisation?
In terms of realizing that it was Richard?
It's him, yes.
So for me, for the archaeologists, and this was quite an interesting thing because for the archaeologists, if it had been 20, 30 years ago, they would have been quite happy to say, look, this is Richard. And I had to say to them, look, hold off, because if we can get DNA out, this will be quite a big thing. They were quite happy to just go and do the press conference. So I was going, hang on. So my first inklings that this what really was when it was December 2012, and I was in Toulouse working with Patricia Ballaresque, who's a very close friend of mine, and we had the first 2 fragments coming back from what would turn out to be Richard, and I was looking at it, and it matched Michael, and I was like going, oh my goodness, this might actually be him. And I knew I had an awful lot to do, but I did do a little dance around the lab. The other thing that I did was because Jo was quite worried, because he's so gracile. She had one of these moments where, when you've got so much pressure on you can't get this wrong. She's like, maybe I've got this wrong. It's so gracile. Maybe it's a woman. So I said, the first thing I will do is I will do a genetic sex test for you. So in that same period when I was in Toulouse, just before Christmas 2012, I texted her with, it's a boy. So she would know it was a boy. But even then, I still knew I had an awful lot to do. So for me, yeah, the genetic evidence was pointing to these being the remains of Richard as well. It was when I did the whole mitochondrial genome, and there was this perfect match with Michael and the single difference. That's when it kind of really hit me of, oh my goodness. So it was actually quite a long process for me in terms of really feeling secure that this was Richard and doing the Bayesian statistical analysis. Yeah, but definitely little dancey things along the way.
So you've been talking about a case where the remains are accessible. And I'm wondering, since sometimes this actually has legal consequences, have there been any exhumations to go after DNA?
Not with any of the stuff that we've been working on with this sort of thing. No, I mean, so that was one of the things about finding living relatives means that you can just consent them. You don't have to go through the whole process of trying to exhume remains to actually be able to do that genetic. Because a lot of people have said, well, why don't you just go for Edward IV? Well, Edward IV's in Windsor. You have to get permission. And generally speaking, you try not to exhume human remains if you don't have to.
I want to ask about the legend that Richard was dug up and thrown in the river, which obviously isn't true, but must presumably be based on the fact that somebody was dug up and thrown in the river.
Yeah, I don't know. So it's a really, it's a really interesting one. So as I say, whilst we were doing the excavation, people were going, you're looking in the wrong place. He's in the river. He's over there. So it's this story that's pervasive. But certainly, so Robert Herrick, who was the mayor, I mean, if Richard had been dug up, he never would have put that thing up. He was born just after the dissolution of monarchy. He would have heard about it. We have no idea where this rumor is from. We don't know where he came up with it. We don't know if it was somebody else or just, who knows? We really don't know with that one.
An excellent talk. Thank you very much
You're
indeed. Is there a preferred part of the skeleton that you try and extract the DNA, or do you try, various bits and pieces and see if they all match up?
Well, so what I was using was the teeth. Because they are great, because they're like a nice little sort of capsule. You can clean them quite easily, and they were great for doing that. During the last 2 or 3 years, we've now realized that in terms of DNA preservation in human remains, it's actually a piece of the body known as the petrous bone. So it's been known for a while that it's the hardest bone in the body. And we now realize it actually contains the most amount of endogenous DNA per square inch. So doing stuff these days, with Sir George Yardley, for doing the skull, I'm going for the petrous bone because that's the most likely to have the best DNA preservation. So petrous and teeth are your best bets, really. But I mean, they've gotten DNA out of finger bones and things like this, so it's perfectly possible.
Is the hunchback a family genetic defect that be passed on to other members of the family?
So it's no. So the way they've called it is idiopathic adolescent onset scoliosis. The idiopathic meaning we don't know why. But what I'm hoping to do with the whole genome analysis is because there have been studies that show that there might be a genetic component to scoliosis, I'd like to have a look in Richard's genome and see if there's anything that might be kind of showing up there, which will be interesting because if there is what looks like a genetic component for him, then it might mean that other people in his family also had it. Basically, we don't know. We don't know the basis for scoliosis at the moment. There seems to be a genetic component, but it's not completely understood at the moment. But again, this is the nice thing about the whole genome analysis. It'll all go online. So, say in 10 years, they do actually work out the genetic component for scoliosis. People will be able to go and have a look at Richard's genome and see if he was predisposed.
Hi, yeah, there are some hair samples of his historical figures that I'm aware of. I was just wondering if you had access to those, how easy those are to extract from.
So again, it really depends on what the conditions are that they've been kept in. If they've been kept very, very warm, DNA starts to degrade much more quickly. But I have been doing hair samples recently, and I've got hair from medieval samples, and the DNA preservation for things like mitochondrial DNA is fantastic. There was the Sakak case that they did a few years ago where they actually had hair from a Sakak individual from about 5,000 years ago. Again, he was in permafrost, and they managed to get about 80% of the genome out of that. So hair is actually fine, and it's quite a good thing because in terms of contamination, you can actually clean it. So you end up like washing somebody's hair before you get the DNA out of it. It's a bit of a slightly surreal thing, but you wash the hair and you dry it, and then you get DNA out of it. Yeah, it's perfectly possible.
Have you any way of finding out whether the scoliosis was caused by something like tuberculosis or any other disease of the time?
So what we can do with the genetics, so I'm not an osteologist, so Joe would be your best person to ask for this sort of thing. But in terms of the genetics point of view, we can see if there's anything that's turning up that looks like it might have TB in it from the genetics point of view. But that's as far as we can go with the DNA side of things.
What do you think is going to be the next big discovery in genetic science?
I'm really interested in epigenetics. So it's not so much a discovery, but just a more of an understanding of what's going on with epigenetics. So for those of you who don't know, epigenetics is that you don't have just the DNA sequence, but there's like another layer of information on top of the DNA. So it's like genes can be switched on and switched off. It's like a dimmer switch on it. And I think that's something that's going to be really, really interesting. And obviously, I haven't read it yet, but there's the news reports about using CRISPR and designer babies and being able to, that's all, it was just apparently in the news this morning. I thought, I'll have a look at that later on when I get home. But it's this use of CRISPR, which again is like a molecular kind of scissor mechanism where you can cut bits of DNA out that you don't want or replace it and this sort of thing. So that brings up the whole idea of sort of designer babies and all of the ethics that goes with that. I think those are going to be big things we're going to be thinking about in the next few years.
Is there any of Richard left in the lab for any future thing?
No, he's been reburied, all of him. So that was quite an interesting thing for me, because as a scientist, normally what you do is you do the entire project and you write it up and it goes off and it gets reviewed and you might have to do some extra experiments and then whatever, and then you publish it. I can't do anything because everything has been put back in the tomb. I have no material to work with. So yeah, it's kind of scary.
That's slightly worrying, your last statement, I would have thought, because with the advances in genetics, being able to read the material, surely this year, next year, 10 years' time, you'll want to have another go and seeing if there's anything else that can
I
be
don't know
found.
if I will, but I mean, it's the sort of thing that people will be able to apply to have the tomb opened. But yes, all of the samples nobody could keep anything. All of the samples went back. So if there wants to be another reexamination, they would have to apply to have the tomb opened, and they would have to have a good scientific question and go through the whole entire process for that.
And how many people are going to look at Richard now? So there was this squabble about where he'd be buried, but
yeah.
So how many people are now going to look at the tomb, visit the tomb?
Sorry, how many are?
Well, the part of the squabble was because both cities could see that this was going to be a huge tourist attraction. So what tourist attraction is it in terms of numbers visiting
Coming to
those
visit
towns?
the tomb.
Yeah.
Well, so we've got a Richard III Visitor Centre. I'm not sure the numbers. I can't remember what they said the numbers were. But it is now something that people come to the cathedral a lot more. So there's a lot of tour groups that come. And certainly what's nice in terms of for the schools is you get a lot of schools coming to the visitor centre. And it's part of their history thing, usually to do with the Tudors, actually, but the end of the Tudor period, and they learn about Richard III that way, and they go through that way. So yes, it's been, for the city, it's been quite a big thing. Because, I mean, as I say, I'm not from Leicester, but when we did the excavation and we got the license, we said that the remains would be placed in the standard archaeological practice nearest consecrated ground, which happened to be the cathedral, which if, from that original picture of the overhead where you could see the car park, the cathedral's like right there, you can throw a stone from it. And so it's been quite a nice thing for the city of Leicester, I think, in that it's kind of put us on the map a little bit, and we now have this thing that people come and visit the city centre. So yeah, it's been really nice.
Are you involved in searching for King Alfred?
I'm not. So I know they were doing that, weren't they, at one point? And they were trying to see if they could find, didn't they have a pelvic bone that they were trying to get DNA from? No, they did ask me about it, and I advised about how you can do this sort of thing. But as far as I don't know what's happened with that one. Yeah.
Now that you've got more or less got all of Richard's genome, can they compare that to the little skeletons that were found in the tower to see if they actually were related to him?
Sorry, say it again.
Yeah, so the little skeletons they found in the tower in the wall.
Oh, yes.
Can you relate that to Richard?
Yes. Okay, so this is the princes in the tower. So it was in the 17th century, wasn't it? They were doing renovations in the Tower of London, which is, so the story is with the princes in the tower that they were taken to the Tower of London, which was not a prison at the time. It was, royal apartments. And they, from about the summer of 1483, so Edward IV dies, I think it's around April 1483, and his son is going to become Edward V, and somewhere over the summer, the children disappear. They've been declared illegitimate because Edward IV had been promised to marry Eleanor Butler previously, and apparently in that time period being promised to somebody else was almost as good as being married. So when he married Elizabeth Woodville, any of his children were thought to be illegitimate. Richard comes to the throne, and the boys go, they seem to disappear. The story is that Richard had them killed. So they are doing, in the Tower of London, they're doing renovations in the 17th century, and they find sets of remains. And apparently, from what I've read, they end up on a spoil heap, and suddenly someone goes, oh, hang on, those might be the princes in the tower, and they're going to scoop them up with all kinds of stuff like chicken bones and so on and so forth. And they end up in an urn in Westminster. Now, this urn was opened in the 1930s and examined by a doctor and a dentist, and they came to the conclusion, based on very, very because there's barely anything left of the skeletons, isn't there? There's very little there, that these were the princes in the tower. But people looking at it now going, well, actually, it's almost like they wanted them to be the princes in the tower. So I have said that if this was going to be done now, we could do a holistic approach like we did with Richard. And I have always said the first thing you would do, if you could get to examine the remains, would be to do radiocarbon dating. Because how do you know they're not Roman or Anglo-Saxon or anything like that? And that would solve your thing right away if they're not from the right time period. If they are from the right time period, you could then do stable isotope and genetic analysis. They are male line relatives of Richard, so you could do Y chromosome analysis on it. Now, there is a story about how Edward IV is not actually the full brother of Richard III. And Cecily, Richard's mom, is supposed to have maybe had a fling with a hunky archer. Laybourne, I think his surname is. Anyway, but that's fine, because with the whole genome from Richard III, you could then do the analysis even taking into the fact that they might not share the same parents, but the same mother. So you just half the amount of DNA that you would be expecting to find. So yes, if it was possible to examine those remains, that would be the approach I would suggest. You have to ask the Queen and the Dean of Westminster. And I know that the Richard III Society and numerous people have asked on numerous occasions, and they've said no. And I can certainly say from my experience with the Richard III project that if someone said to me, so would you do this? I'd be like, yes, I'd be a really interesting project to do, but I'm not telling the press before we start this project, because the amount of interest is insane. And one of the things that we found quite difficult working on the project is that we just wanted to get our heads down and get the work done quietly, calmly, and that's exactly what you'd want to do in this case. You don't want the distractions of all that stuff going on. You just want to quietly and calmly get on with the project, bring all of the evidence together, write it up, send it for review, and then you tell people once you've actually properly done the analysis. But it would be a very, very interesting project to do. The other thing I do say is that even if we could do all of that, it still doesn't say who killed them. So I can understand the reticence to some extent, because it's not going to answer that particular mystery. It would just tell you whether or not the evidence is consistent with these being the princes in the tower. But a very interesting case. Yeah.
You described how at the outset of the project there was a good deal of doubt, cynicism about why go ahead with this and the chances of finding the king's remains. That being the case, how much opposition and indifference did you have to overcome in the local council and other bodies from whom you needed to get permissions and so forth?
Well, so it was Philippa. So Philippa, all power to her, she basically got the entire project off the ground. She got the university on board, we committed funding, she got the Leicester City Council on board, she brought in the television crew and everything. She basically got this project up and running. So I don't know tons about that. I got brought in quite early, but basically from the genetics point of view. But my understanding is it's Philippa's sort of persistence, determination that got her involved. Certainly from the university point of view, it was, well, we're not going to find Richard, but for Richard Buckley, it was a really interesting case because he's been excavating in Leicester for the last 30 years. But that's a part of Leicester you don't normally get to excavate in. So for him, he was really interested because he thought, wow, we can actually potentially find the Greyfriars Friary. He was really interested in finding the friary grounds. So my understanding is that when I first heard about it, I was like, yeah, I'm happy to be involved. I'm happy to advise and do whatever. I'm more than happy to be involved. So I think the university, as far as I know, it was kind of fairly straightforward with that. I can't say anything for how much it took to get the Leicester City Council involved. But yes, we were all very kind of like, no, we're not going to find Richard. It'll be fine. Then we find him on the first day. And that was one of the things for the university, because obviously we'd committed a certain amount of funding to it, but suddenly all of the scientific analysis had to be done, and so the university was having to get the money down the back of the sofa to actually pay for all of this scientific analysis to actually be carried out. So, yeah.
Okay. I think we're... Right, if anyone does have a question, we have a drinks reception in the library for people to go to. So do stay and chat with Turi.
Yeah.
But I'd just like to, on behalf of the Genetics Society, thank Turi for a really, really wonderful and engaging, fantastic storytelling, brilliant talk. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.